Good afternoon, folks. It is me again, Paul Woodadge, here for WW2TV, an afternoon show, and we're continuing, I guess, our Eastern Front theme. We did the 3 shows last week about Poland and Warsaw particularly, but today we're broadening the scope a little bit to talk about the Red Army over the course of several years of warfare. And joining me from UK this time is interesting Dr. Prit Buttar, who has been busy this week helping out with vaccines and COVID, and so we're grateful to have you join us today, Prit. Thanks for being part of this.
You're very welcome. It's good to be on the show.
So, we'll let you get talking in a minute, but I wanted to start by saying that a lot of people watching, and myself included, we have these cliched ideas of the Red Army about just throwing lots and lots of men into battle and not being particularly tactically savvy, not being particularly, refined in their tactics. And gradually, I think, thanks to historians like yourself and your output, we're starting to change our view of the Red Army and look at some of the innovations they're doing. And it isn't just about numbers, although of course numbers does come into it, and they are actually developing things, but it goes through a series of developments. So let's start off with the morphing of the Red Army from the kind of post-revolution era up to the outbreak of World War II, or we should be referred to as the Great Patriotic War, and what the army had been, how it starts the war, and then we can go from there.
Yes, of course. One of the things that I think a lot of English-speaking historians or enthusiasts miss out on is that the Soviets were second only to the Germans in terms of the volume of military writing between the wars. They developed an awful lot of concepts about how a future war would be fought. And a lot of this came down to a school of thought championed by Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He was a Civil War veteran. He commanded the Red Army when it invaded Poland in the very early 1920s. And he wrote extensively about the concept of something called deep battle. And this was the concept of engaging the enemy in the full depth of their position, up to 120 kilometers deep, in order to achieve a decisive breakthrough and a decisive success. He talked about the use of airborne forces, of mechanized forces, and of cavalry alongside the traditional infantry and artillery. The Red Army exercised and practiced this sort of concept of warfare. A lot of this came out of their experiences of the First World War, where even when they had succeeded in achieving local successes, as was the case on the Western Front in the First World War, it was one thing to capture a set of trench lines. It was quite another to cut your way through the entire depth of enemy positions. And Tukhachevsky and others saw the appearance of mechanized forces as a means of achieving this. Unfortunately for the Red Army, Tukhachevsky fell foul of Joseph Stalin, who suspected him of plotting with Russian emigres against the Bolsheviks. The irony is there was a little bit of truth in this, in that Tukhachevsky did have contact with some anti-Bolshevik movements, but not in any meaningful sense. The Germans attempted to claim that they had mounted a misinformation campaign to get Tukhachevsky suspected of this, but I don't think that's true. I think Stalin was quite capable of suspecting anyone off his own bat without any encouragement. Tukhachevsky was arrested, tortured, sentenced, and executed in short order. And the documentation that was produced by the court confirming his death sentence and in fact his confession is marked with a spatter of blood droplets from his interrogation. It's quite an appalling document, really. This was the beginning of the Great Purge of the Red Army in the 1930s, where pretty much every region commander, these are the regions would then be mobilized as fronts once the war began. Every region commander, most of the ones who replaced them, most of the army commanders, huge numbers of division commanders and corps commanders, all just disappeared. Many of them were executed out of hand. Others were sent off for prolonged periods of imprisonment. Konstantin Rokossovsky, who commanded troops with great distinction during the war, was one of those arrested. He was very badly treated and had all of his teeth knocked out during his interrogations, but he refused to sign a confession. And even when he was released, when the war began, he made a great thing about wearing stainless steel false teeth, just to make the point that he'd lost his teeth in the prison camps. The result was that the Red Army, on the eve of the war, had doctrine which was pretty much as advanced as anybody else's, and it had some very good equipment. The T-34s were beginning to appear, but it had lost pretty much all of the decent officer corps, and it had lost huge numbers of men who had trained well and were experienced in commanding large formations. The communists had imposed the political commissar system with great rigor to ensure political reliability of future commanders, and this very much hamstrung all decisions. When the Red Army invaded Finland in 1939, all of its weaknesses were exposed. Most of the tanks didn't have radios. They had a bizarre system by which once the battle began, the command tank was meant to communicate with subordinates by waving different colored flags out of the turret. Whether or not anyone was going to have enough time to look out of their turret to see whose flags were waving and what color they were, the result of it was that once the battle began, tanks tended to behave in a very rigid manner. They would try to implement the original orders and showed no flexibility whatever. The Red Army continued to use anti-tank rifles long after they had been abandoned by pretty much every other, certainly by the Western armies. And actually they used them with great effect. They found that at close range they were still very effective, particularly for immobilizing tanks. You could knock out a tank track with one of these. As many of your listeners, I'm sure, know, it was normal for German tank commanders to fight with their head and shoulders exposed from the turret. They felt that the improved field of view compensated for any risk. And the number of occasions where after-action reports describe officers being killed by head wounds or even decapitation testifies to the accuracy of these anti-tank rifles, which were used really to encourage the Germans to button up. And of course, in urban warfare, they were very effective because you could fire from an upstairs window down onto the soft deck armor of a tank with a fairly high likelihood of success, particularly as you'd only be firing at about 10, 20, 30 meters range at that point. So the Red Army comes into the Second World War with this mixture of some very good kit, an awful lot of obsolescent kit, but that's true of pretty much every army.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, yeah.
Yeah, everyone talks about the Blitzkrieg and about panzer divisions, but everyone kind of overlooks the fact that the German infantry in particular was massively dependent upon horses to move all of the heavy equipment. And the horse losses in the first 6 months of the war in the East, they basically left the infantry divisions almost immobile. So when there was all this talk of, does the Wehrmacht stand and fight outside Moscow or does it retreat? To an extent, it had no choice but to either stand and fight or abandon pretty much all of its heavy kit because all the horses were dead and they were just, they just didn't have draft animals left. So everybody goes into the war with a mixture of good stuff, old-fashioned stuff, good ideas, old-fashioned ideas that aren't going to work. And it's very easy to mistake the Red Army as this sort of blundering, hopelessly obsolete organization. They actually had very good doctrine. They couldn't implement it because of the purges and because of the political orthodoxy that was imposed. And they were in the process of re-equipping and modernizing their forces.
Would it be fair to say that the abortive attempt to invade Finland actually was almost a blessing in disguise for the Soviets, because they realized that this balance between getting the politics right and getting the tactical nous right, you've got to get the tactical right bit right. So maybe it helped them, because, you know, you look at the British Army in 1940, all that phony war period, without engaging the enemy, how are you going to know if your tactics are working or not working? And then clearly leading up to Dunkirk, they needed some improvement. But that early engagement, that first blood there, where they were, let's be honest, I wanted to do some winter war shows. It just didn't happen. I couldn't find historians, but yeah, they had their ass handed to them on a plate, didn't they? The Soviets in that, really. And you know, they must have learned a lot. The learning curve was ridiculously steep there, but it had to lead to improvements.
Well, certainly they did get their backsides very firmly kicked in that, and they ground the Finns down just by on this occasion by sheer weight of numbers. There are a couple of caveats, though. Although extensive reports were written on the failings of the Red Army, very little of that was put into practice by the summer of 1941. And the other issue is that fighting in the swamps and forests of the north, for example, is very, very different from fighting on the open Ukrainian steppe. So the universality of the lessons that were learned was limited. And it was easy for the traditionalists to say, well, no, this is just because of the exceptional nature of fighting in the northern forests and swamps. As a result, few of the lessons had actually been implemented, although there were lots of recommendations for improvements in communications, better radios, putting more radios in tanks, etc., etc. But they hadn't actually got around to doing an awful lot of this. Well, the result of the purges, though, was that Stalin was now very, very dependent upon his little group of old Civil War comrades. So people who actually hadn't a particularly stunning military record, and their experiences were heavily out of date, assumed positions of great power in the run-up to the Second World War. People like Voroshilov, Budyonny, and others like and Timoshenko, and they were given very high-ranking posts. And if you think that Budyonny, for example, was a cavalry commander in the Civil War, he commanded the great cavalry army that was meant to invade Poland in the Russian-Polish War, and he was still commanding huge forces at the outbreak of the Second World War, even though he personally still thought that there was a place for massed cavalry charges, etc. So the poor old Red Army goes into this conflict really hamstrung and with considerable difficulties. And it was a while before the new rising generation of people like Zhukov and Konyev were able to make their mark. And many of them actually almost had to win their spurs in battle. They had to fight in the frontier battles. They had to survive those, show some skill and some distinction in those before Stalin was prepared to trust them. And quite a lot of the senior commanders of June 1941 were either dead or imprisoned by the end of the year. Stalin didn't tolerate failure at all, really, as in those early days.
So, you know, we particularly called this show the Red Army from 42 to 44. So we should sort of get on with that. So, but that 41 period. So you were talking about these leaders coming in, and, you know, the cavalry and outdated. Now, what were the catalysts for the change? Was it experience in battle? Was it the doctrine coming through? Was it people reading this pre-war manuals and writing? How did things change? Was it from Stalin? Was it from someone else?
Well, it starts at the Battle of Moscow, really, where until then everything's been going wrong. The Red Army has had its momentary successes, which David Glantz, for example, argues were decisive in delaying the Red Army's advance on Moscow long enough for the Red Army to survive that initial blow. In January 41, having thrown the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow, the Red Army launched its first major offensive operation as opposed to local counterattacks and local counteroffensives. And this was intended to destroy Army Group Center in particular, but Stalin widened this to pretty much the entire Eastern Front. Having thrown the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow, he believed that actually the Wehrmacht was broken and they could be driven back quite easily. So the more pressure that was put on them, the better. And in a way, this is a rerun of the 1914-1918 strategy that all of the Allied powers adopted against the Central Powers in the First World War, which was, if we all keep attacking all the time, sooner or later we're going to break through. Sooner or later Germany will come to the end of its resources. So in a way, Stalin is still thinking in that mindset of, if we inflict enough hammer blows along the front, we will break through somewhere. In his memoirs, Zhukov writes that he was quite against this, and he wanted to concentrate the Red Army's remaining resources for the counteroffensive outside Moscow in particular. I'm always left wondering how much of this is with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, he certainly ordered his armies into action and made no attempt even locally to concentrate his resources. He spread his effort across the whole width of Western Front outside Moscow. And there was a notorious incident where, when a cavalry corps was about to be committed into the action, the commander of the cavalry corps, Belov, complained that his men were already quite run down from earlier fighting and hadn't recovered their strength or their numbers yet. Zhukov sent his second in command, Zakharov, to the cavalry corps, and Zakharov told Belov and his officers, you're going to break through, and I don't care if I have to execute half of you in order to get you to break through. We are not here to argue about what resources you have, merely about you doing what you've been ordered to do. So here you have the absolute stereotype and the cliche of the Red Army just being bludgeoned forward. And unfortunately, January and February saw precisely that. It saw these precious reserves, the last uncommitted troops from the peacetime army, just being bled white in utterly futile attacks against Army Group Centre and elsewhere. And yes, they inflicted a lot of damage on the Germans, but it was at a horrendous price in terms of losses. So really, this was, if you like, the point at which people started thinking, we can't do it this way. There has to be a better way of doing this.
Yeah. So I mean, and also we I suppose we ought to address as well that it's harder to impose your style of tactics when you are reacting to what's happening around you. So the first part of the war, the Soviets are being attacked by the Germans. So they're the reactors. Then later on, they become the aggressors. So it's when you're on the defensive. I know that's a very sweeping term, and it's not quite that precise, but it's hard to impose your own will on that battle there. One of the things I particularly liked about reading Retribution, your latest book, was you do a lot of work into this what I would call the support side of things, the engineering, the artillery, and I think all of us, we can't help when we think of Red Army, we think of T-34s pushing at speed across the open plains, and the infantry and the banners and the flags and the PPSH 41s, all that kind of stuff. And that, in the same way that's slightly misleading, in the same way we think about German army with Tiger tanks, and there's this big arm behind it, and it's the military might that the Soviet Union brings to it that eventually does make a difference. But how does all that go on at the same time? Because Stalin, I can't see myself as being someone who's got much time for the logistics side of it. He's more kind of moving tanks on maps. So who's behind the scenes getting the logistics sorted out?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, I would make the same criticism of Zhukov and people like Konev too. They give the impression of being map board generals. So, for example, at the moment I'm writing my next book, which is about the Rzhev salient in 42, and you just see bludgeoning attacks against Model's Ninth Army. There is an account by a man who served as a new recruit in one of the divisions thrown into action by Konev. This division had spent 3 months behind the front line, completing its formation, preparing for action. By the end of the first morning of combat, when it went into action, a third of its personnel were dead. And his personal account, it just highlights this personal account of an infantryman just describes everything that goes wrong. He describes the initial artillery bombardment, very impressive. As we advanced, the German guns opened up on us and the fire became more and more intense. So, despite its impressive nature, the artillery had failed to suppress the German defenses. He describes how a group of T-34s moved through their ranks with infantry riding on their backs. We tried our best to keep up with them, but the tanks disappeared ahead. So there was no real cooperation between the armor and the infantry. The armor just pushed on into the depths. Without infantry support, it was then picked off. Without armored support, the infantry couldn't move forward. He talks about looking back and seeing second and third waves of troops coming forward, concentrated so tightly that the German artillery just slaughtered them as they advanced. So again, the German guns have not been suppressed. The following on waves are too tightly compressed. There's a desperation to get them into action, which means that they're advancing too soon, perhaps, and certainly too densely, and they just get cut to pieces. So this one account epitomizes how much there was to learn, and all the way through those actions, and also all the other fighting that was going on. So Timoshenko's failed attempt to retake Kharkov, and the Army Group South's drive towards Stalingrad, you see the same problems arising again and again. And at this stage, after each of these great operations, the Red Army would have a period of reflection, if you like, where the staff officers would write detailed reports on what they felt had gone wrong. And they were excellent reports. But then you come to the next action and nothing has changed. And they're still trying to do it the same way. And everyone is saying, you can't do this unless you have more fuel and ammunition readily available and it moves forward quickly. But, for example, you still have Zhukov attempting to advance on Rzhev through the same countryside where there are no decent roads. So even if you manage to get enough artillery ammunition stockpiled and enough fuel stockpiled, you can't move the guns and ammunition forward to keep up with the infantry because there just aren't any roads. And this was a lesson that was learned painfully slowly. And so even when we get to the end of 1942 and the first successful deep operation by the Red Army at Stalingrad with Uranus and the encirclement of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad, even there, the support of those spearheads is quite weak. And the Red Army, as was actually typical of most armies of the period, lost as many tanks to breakdowns and to terrain difficulties as it lost to German action. As a result, by the time the encirclement is completed, those tank brigades are actually very, very weak. And again, one of the great evolutionary steps throughout the war, the engineering support of tank brigades is just steadily increased. And right the way up to 1945, the Red Army is still increasing the number of tank recovery crews and the number of tank repair teams, something that the Panzer divisions have had from the outset. And the Red Army is still learning that actually this is the best way of keeping your units at strength, because it means that those lightly damaged tanks, those stranded tanks, the tanks that have shed their tracks, etc., can be fixed and got into action. And even though you're still only going to be at 2/3 strength, that's a lot better than being at 1/3 strength, and it allows you to maintain the operation at a higher tempo. But you're right, this was something that came up. And in a way, we can think of this evolutionary period not so much in terms of Stalin becoming better at what he did, or even Zhukov and Konev becoming better at what they did. It's more to do with the ranks below them. So this is at army level and at division level and corps level, and particularly with head of logistics of an army or head of artillery of an army. These are the people who are learning their skills and passing on best practice and getting better and better. So some of the orders from above remain as rigid and as murderous as in the earlier phases, but the Red Army's getting better at implementing those without massive casualties.
You reminded me of I did a show with Arthur Galaxon, the Canadian, about the Canadian Army in the Second Army in Normandy, and about their incredible ability to replace tanks. And they worked on like a triage system, so that a tank was assessed, and then within 10 minutes they could decide whether the tank could be repaired or not repaired, and then it would taken back, and how efficient that was. And it's interesting when you said about these things coming from a lower level, because it was a brigadier whose name escapes me in the Italian campaign, for the Canadians recognized this shortfall of, it's all very well that we're making new tanks, but they're in Canada. It's better to get the ones that are in combat that are really already at the front and repair them and get them, because they're there. And so it's interesting that thing's happening in Russia. It does also, the question coming up, we all know, of course, about the importance of Lend-Lease and how the Soviets are being given Studebaker trucks and this, that, and the other. Is there any kind of swapping of tactical now? Are the allies, the Western allies, giving them any advice on, look, we've been doing this with the Germans in North Africa, this seems to work? Or is there any sharing information on that line, or is it all completely just equipment?
Clearly, there were the military attaches on both sides who would pass their observations back. So I'm not aware of any specific occasions, though, where let us say British officers of say Major Lieutenant Colonel level would have had the opportunity to meet their Soviet counterparts to discuss the sort of tactical and low-level operational expertise that each side was getting. To an extent, a lot of these skills would not necessarily have been transferable. Some of the equipment was different, and of course the terrain was very different. So if you compare the fighting in Italy or in Northern Europe, it's not often that you get a clear shot at anything more than maybe 2 or maybe 3 kilometers range, whereas out on the steppe, the long-barreled German guns can just pick things off at very, very long range and are very, very effective weapons. And the tank recovery thing is a very interesting question, because one of the reasons why, when you see these figures for German armored losses compared to, let's say, Red Army losses, one of the great discrepancies is that the Germans, in their after-action reports, would only record as lost or destroyed tanks that had gone up in flames or had been blown apart or were irreparable. So if you towed back several tanks that had, let's say, shed a track or stripped a sprocket or something, those were shown as tanks awaiting repair. Now, when you're going backwards, as the Wehrmacht was for much of the war in the East, a lot of those tanks end up being abandoned because you don't have the equipment to move them, and particularly if you have to bug out at speed, you're just going to use a demolition charge and get out. Those destroyed tanks never turn up on official losses. So in a way, one of the more reliable measures of German tank losses is to look at the reported strength of frontline units and compare that with German tank production. So if you know, and we do know fairly accurately, how many, let's say, Panzer IVs or Panthers German industry produced in 1944, you can then compare that with the number of units that they're feeding and supplying, and it gives you an idea that the losses must be roughly the same. Otherwise, they should have a proliferating number of units or whatever. So reported tank losses are very difficult. In Retribution, I described, I beg your pardon, in the latest book, in The Reckoning, I described one action in which there's a Tiger tank trying to find a way across a river, and it's hit something like 12 or 15 times before it's finally knocked out. At one point, the tank is ablaze, and the crew inside it are fighting the fire with fire extinguishers, and the tank is still going. And you know that every one of those 15 Soviet gunners claimed a kill. So, the estimates of how many tanks they've killed out or planes they've shot down is always a bit suspect. And that's true of every army.
Every army, every war, every campaign. So I want to bring things back to Operation Uranus, because we talk about Stalingrad as being a turning point, and lots of people refer to it as the turning point of the war. But just in my prep for this show, as I always do, it's interesting, when you search Operation Uranus, very little comes up. When you search Stalingrad, Google goes into overtime and everything comes up. And I think we're guilty again of people who are enthusiastic about World War II and studying it, of focusing everything about the city, everything about the fighting there, and the sewers and the factories and the island of fire and all that fascinating stuff, but not looking at the what's happening around it, the movement of these armies. And you said earlier on that you see that as the turning point in the tactical skill acquiring the Red Army did. So just explain a bit where you draw that conclusion from, and kind of not focus on the city, but the movement of these armies to encircle the Germans, and how masterful it was, and how they learned it, and how they could then take that forwards.
when the plans were being drawn up by Zhukov and Vasilevsky in particular, Stalin wanted to move both that northern strike group and the southern group closer to the city. He felt they should pinch off a smaller pocket, and he thought this was overly risky. But the commanders felt that actually, no, we have to. We do have to attack further away from Sixth Army, because we want to hit the Romanians in particular, and we want to leave the Germans with less opportunity to react. At this stage, even in this operation, there was quite poor cooperation between Soviet armor and Soviet infantry, but it was a darn sight better than it had been. And so when the two spearheads met just near Kalash on the Don, a lot of the infantry had kept up with them. And the official Soviet era accounts describe the two sides guided towards each other by firing flares in the darkness, and the soldiers embracing as they met. It was slightly more shambolic than that, in that when they bumped into each other, there was quite a fierce exchange of fire before they realized that actually they were shooting at their own side, and that it wasn't a German armored formation heading in the other direction. And then as the fighting gradually died down and people started shouting at each other in Russian, they realized that actually they had achieved this encirclement. This is an evolutionary thing. The operation called for, once the pocket had been created and the encirclement had been created, the tank brigades were meant to turn outwards and, were meant to turn inwards to destroy the pocket. And the cavalry corps that had accompanied each penetration was meant to turn outwards to pursue the Germans and drive them away from the encirclement. They found that the cavalry was actually very weak for this, and in any event, the tanks had lost far too many tanks getting to the center in order to do very much. So this was one of the things that the Red Army tried to learn from the post-mortem. Why did Sixth Army succeed in holding out for, well, let's face it, 2 months, tying down such a large amount of the Red Army, when those troops might have had a decisive effect in the fighting that was pouring over the Don and towards the Donetsk Valley and towards the Donbass. And this was one of the things that the Red Army was very anxious to learn from. If we do achieve an encirclement like this, how do we build on our success faster so that we can maximize the gain? Because again, much like the previous winter, Stalin just got carried away completely and started saying, yeah, we've cracked it. This is the end of the war. We can now pursue the Germans back across the Ukraine. If we can get to the Dnieper first, we can knock out the bridges, we destroy the whole southern flank. And to an extent, he was right. But it's one thing to do that on a map, it's quite another to do that on the ground in the middle of the winter. And the death of Sixth Army, however awful it was for the Germans, bought enough time for Manstein to pull an army group out of the Caucasus and to use it in his counter-offensive. But for the Red Army, despite its rather chastening setback, and it should be remembered that despite the magnitude of German losses at Stalingrad, the Red Army actually lost more men and tanks in the entire campaign than the Germans did. But despite that, they had undoubtedly learned how to do it. And for them, there were a number of things to build on here. The use of artillery to achieve the initial breakthrough went much, much better than it had done before. A lot is made of the fact that the two pincers struck the Romanians and the Romanians collapsed in a heap. The truth is of course, a little bit more complicated than that. And whilst there's no doubt that the Romanians were overcome quite quickly, some of the Romanians did fight on for quite some time. Lashkar on the northern side fought on with an encircled group of Romanians for several days, expecting that the Germans would fight their way through to him. In the end, he then defected to the Soviet side and commanded a Romanian army towards the end of the war against the Germans. But it should be remembered that it wasn't just the Romanians and indeed the Hungarians and Italians along the Don who collapsed. Right at the top end of that line was the German Second Army, at the southern end of Army Group Centre. And when it came under pressure, it proved to be about as resilient as its Italian and Hungarian and Romanian neighbours had been. It too disintegrated quite quickly. So if the German infantry had been holding the line at either side of Stalingrad, I imagine the Red Army might have had a harder time breaking through. But the outcome might not have been that different in the end. And it was very convenient for everybody to blame the Romanians for the disaster. But actually,
always blame the foreigners. That's how every army does the same way. Blame the foreigners.
Indeed, and there's nothing new in that, is there? No. And actually, as 1943 and 44 unfolds, certainly in 1940, at the end of 1944, when the Red Army bursts across the Dniester Valley into Romania itself, again, there was a lot of fuss made that the Romanians just actually gave up and defected en masse. The truth of the matter is that on the first day of that operation, the Red Army managed to achieve an average penetration of 6 to 10 kilometers. And you kind of feel that if the Romanians were just waving them past, they'd have pushed on a wee bit faster than that. But in the post-war era, it served the purposes of the Germans who were writing their memoirs to blame the Romanians. It served the purposes of the Romanians who are now part of the Soviet bloc to say, well, we weren't that keen to fight alongside the Germans anyway. And it's really only since the fall of the Iron Curtain that Romanian historians have started digging into some of the recollections of veterans and pointing out that actually Romanian troops put up quite a lot of resistance at times, but they were either unsupported or in the end they were just overwhelmed by the Red Army.
And just as an aside question that came to my head here, because you've written extensively about multiple campaigns and multiple eras, but Stalingrad is the Gettysburg, it's the D-Day, it's the Waterloo, it is the Battle of the Eastern Front. That even people who don't understand Eastern Front, they all think they know a little about Stalingrad. And over the years, you've been researching and you've been covering it. As historians, you have to kind of cut through the propaganda, the Soviet-made propaganda movies post-war, and the way they talked about it. What have been the things you've learned about just particularly on that battle? Before we get back to the Red Army, what myths did you go into believing that you've since realised are complete nonsense? Just as an aside question.
Well, I think the biggest one has been a re-evaluation of the role of Germany's allies, particularly the Romanians and actually the Italians too, and also the manner in which the Germans treated them. They really weren't very good to their allies. They didn't provide them with as much support as they had promised. The Italian and Romanian troops in particular had been promised extensive supplies of anti-tank equipment, and very little of that appeared. And as a result, they, when they did come under armoured attack, they were pretty defenceless. It should be pointed out that when the Italian army collapsed on the Don, there was an SS cavalry brigade serving alongside them. And it proved to be about as resilient as the Italians, in fact less so, and was utterly routed in no time at all. It's one thing to go around burning villages claiming they're partisans, it's quite another to fight the Red Army in the snow, And the Italians were left pretty much to their own devices to fight their way to the west. The story of the Italian army on the Don is one of just unending tragedy, really. They were under constant attack by the Red Army. German units passing them would often force them at gunpoint to hand over their vehicles. They would drive Italian soldiers out of shelter and take shelter themselves in houses. When the Italian survivors eventually reached a degree of safety and were put on trains back to Italy, they found that Mussolini's Italy was completely unprepared for the number of seriously wounded and ill people who arrived, and they died in droves of frostbite and illness. It is almost an unending tragedy, and again just forgotten, because in the end, they were the losers, and these little episodes just disappear into history, really.
Yeah, Neil Lawrence, who appeared on our show last week, he said that he believes it's the Italians coming back from Stalingrad to Italy that were the tipping point of the anti-Mussolini feeling, and that if they'd gone somewhere else, or it was that sort of just tip the balance. And it's an interesting, rabbit hole to go down. But we've got to press on about the Red Army. So post Uranus, that's my phone pinging off there. The Russians are essentially on the offensive now. So how are they changing their army? I mean, I like to just an idea to compare it to my viewers. And I know it's you can't compare like for like divisions and groups and army groups, but we know that the British, for example, by 43, 44, putting a lot of their focus on artillery, because we're running out of manpower. Are the Soviets changing the makeup of their army? What lessons have they taken forward? Where are they putting their strength for the next operations?
Yeah, in fact, there is evolution at every level. So, for example, in the summer of 42, after the failed Soviet attempts to stop the Germans driving towards the Don and towards Stalingrad, Pavel Rotmistrov, who eventually commanded 5th Guards Tank Army at Stalingrad and after, he wrote a report in which he described all of the shortcomings of Soviet armored formations. He said, we have this mixture of light tanks, the T-34s, and then the heavy KV tanks. He said the light tank, when a tank brigade deploys, the light tanks get into action first. By the time other tanks arrive, they're pretty much knocked out, because they can't stand on their own. The KVs are useless because they destroy every bridge they go over, so the support elements then can't follow. And in the end, it's left to the T-34s to do all the heavy lifting. So can we just concentrate on those? He was the one who then labored the point and said, this isn't a luxury. We need a radio in every single tank. This is, absolutely vital. And then little practical things. He was the man who advocated welding handles to the outside of turrets so that tank riders could ride on the back of tanks and keep up with the armor, because there weren't enough trucks, there weren't enough half tracks, etc., to do that. So at that level, the equipment itself is being subtly redesigned and improved. There's a lot of use of artillery now. Not least because those awful casualties of the earlier years mean that you can't rely on the infantry to overwhelm the other side, and you do need the artillery to do a better job of suppressing the Germans. And German veterans, will freely describe how the sheer weight of Soviet artillery just steadily increased during the war. And by the end of the war, the Red Army would just shell you into concussion until you just couldn't think straight anymore. And it was a very good force multiplier. It was a very good substitute for those awful human wave attacks of the earlier years. We've already touched on the improved engineering support, but it's worth just stopping and thinking about the logistic support, and the Lend-Lease stuff that you mentioned earlier is very, very critical to this. After Kursk, the Red Army maintains a pretty much continuous offensive across central Ukraine. So after driving the Germans out of Kharkov and Belgorod, it pursues them across central Ukraine. The Germans fall back on the Dnieper, intending to hold the line of the Dnieper, only to find the Red Army arrives in some cases before them, and if not then very shortly after, and forces the river almost on the line of march. It then pursues the Germans across the Dnieper, so that by the end of 1943, it's only at a couple of key points that the Wehrmacht is still actually on the Dnieper River. And this is all done across terrain that the Germans have been devastating as they retreat. So all the bridges, all the railroads, many of the roads have been destroyed. And yet, pretty much no Soviet operation is cancelled at this stage through a shortage of fuel or ammunition. They're still managing to keep all of that logistic supply moving forward and keeping their armies fed, keeping them fueled, keeping them armed. And that is an absolutely astonishing achievement because, if you read Halder's War Diary, for example, even in 1942, during the drive to Stalingrad, almost every other day he's mentioning, operations being curtailed because of fuel shortages, because of ammunition shortages. And yet the Red Army is moving far, far greater volumes of stuff over devastated terrain. With tremendous effect. And, these are the unsung heroes of the Eastern Front, these logistics officers, the train drivers, the people who were repairing the bridges. And the job that they did was absolutely astonishing, just keeping those supplies moving under very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, and from my experience and my limited reading of the Eastern Front, I haven't read enough about that logistics side of things and the importance of the railways and things like that. It's always falls back in the exciting hand-to-hand fighting in factories and things like that. It's like, yeah, I like that, but I want to know the big stuff as well. I want to pick up on something you said about the handles on the T-34s and things like that and the improvement with radios, because people do like talking about kit. And at this point of the war, the Germans are tending to kind of just favor a new tank design, a new half-track design, a new everything. And of course, that brings in its problems of you ending up throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because then you've got to change over your maintenance programs, you've got to change over your spare parts, all the instruction changes. Do you think it's a key factor to the Soviets that they do persist with and refine the equipment that they've established? Because as you said earlier on at the top of the show, the T-34 is not brand new. I mean, it's several years old by 43, 44, but they refine it and they improve it rather than, okay, we need something new. Is that a masterstroke by there, or is it by accident rather than design?
I think some of it is necessity. Some of it is due to the dislocation of Soviet industry, the moving of factories to the east, the creation of the enormous tank factories around Chelyabinsk at the bottom end of the Urals, what became known as Stalingrad, where a lot of the factories ended up. Standardization was very effective, because it's not only the T-34s, a lot of the gun carriages, a lot of the assault guns, they actually have the same chassis, which makes that job of recovering damaged vehicles, cannibalizing them for spares, it greatly improves your chances of success. And even though the tanks are evolving, the key things are not evolving. They're not changing the gearbox. They're not changing the engine. Yes, the T-34 goes through a big midlife step improvement with the new turret and the 85mm gun. But actually the mechanical drivetrain, etc., that remains pretty much the same. So you don't have to retrain the mechanics. By contrast, although throughout the war, you only have two official versions of the Tiger tank. You have the original Tiger, and then you have the King Tiger. Of the original Tiger, it was subject to continuous minor improvements. And although, something like 1,500, 1,800 were built, I can't remember the precise number.
I think about 1,500, I think, yeah.
At no time were there more than about 20 identical Tiger tanks. They all differed slightly. It might have been something fairly trivial, like a different radio or something like that. Or in some cases, for example, some of the fuel couplings went from a 3-bolt flange to a 4-bolt flange. Now that means you can't cannibalize that tank to use it to repair another tank. Or if you've got the wrong flange, you can't fix this thing. It makes your maintenance problems much harder. The other thing is that the unreliability of some of the German kit is something that's glossed over. And, I've always had this thing about people who claim that the Panther tank was this great armored vehicle and this great medium range tank. Well, first of all, it's actually quite heavy for a medium tank. And secondly, far more Panthers were lost from mechanical breakdown than from enemy action. And it was routine for a Panther-equipped battalion to lose something like a quarter of its strength even before it came into contact with the enemy. So the importance of tank recovery then becomes all the greater. And as these tanks are now far bigger than the old Panzer IVs, recovering them becomes a bigger job too. It's actually quite hard work to haul a vehicle that heavy off a battlefield. When it comes to tactics, one of the things that the Red Army really improved on and had tremendous benefit from was they stole the German concept of the pack front and they turned it into something of an art form. In 1941, the Germans had started changing their doctrine for the use of anti-tank guns. And instead of the anti-tank battalion of, let's say, a Panzer division deploying its guns in pairs or in small numbers, they realized that these guns would then get overwhelmed by a mass column of Soviet armor. So they started deploying their anti-tank guns en masse. And the idea was that a single commander would then direct the fire of all of the guns. The Red Army saw that this was a very effective tactic, and of course they had large numbers of anti-tank guns, so they started creating entire anti-tank brigades. And these brigades had organic combat engineer support. And this was the refinement that as Soviet armor advanced from 1943 onwards, it's followed by anti-tank brigades, which very, very rapidly deploy in anticipation of a German counterattack. They know the panzer divisions are going to launch a counterattack because that's what the Germans do. But now you've got combat engineers alongside them who very, very rapidly, astonishingly rapidly, lay minefields to constrain the movements of German armor, to channel it onto the guns of the anti-tank brigades, which can then inflict very serious losses quite quickly. And the tactical use of those anti-tank guns also evolved. And a lot of this was literally from the front line up. I came across the memoirs of an anti-tank gunner who was with Konyev's forces when they crossed the lower Vistula in the second half of 1944 into the Sandomierz bridgehead. And he described how once they deployed, it became normal practice for pretty much the entire gun crew to hide in a trench behind the gun. And only 2 men would man the gun. They'd take it in turn. So one was aiming and firing and one was loading. He said, as a result of this, in the month of August, our gun was replaced 3 times, either with a replacement new gun or with a repaired gun. We suffered no crew fatalities during that time. Several of the crew were wounded, but because most of the guys were taking cover, actually we didn't lose men. He also described one of the other incidents I came across was how the Red Army had learned to make the best use of its equipment. And actually, I'm sure this was true of troops all over the front lines on all sides. A tanker in one of the cavalry corps described how his tank battalion was equipped with Lend-Lease Sherman tanks. And he said how they used these with great effect. And he and his battalion became famous as tiger tank hunters. And he described how they would put, because the Tigers were so heavy, they couldn't really motor across country. They knew they were going to come down the roads. So they would position 1 or 2 Shermans in an ambush position. And the job of these tanks was basically to hit the Tiger's tracks and then get out of there. So they would immobilize the Tiger, at which point the rest of the tank company would attack it from its flanks and rear and go up against the weaker armor. So they're learning to make the best use of their equipment. So even if they're not, upgrading their armor with new tanks and getting a bigger gun and better armor-piercing ammunition, they're still using it to devastating effect.
And what's so fascinating to me is that although we're talking about the Soviets right now, you could be talking about the US Army at this same period, because they're doing exactly the same thing. The anti-tank, the tank destroyer units they're developing, the combat engineer units they're developing, the predictability of the Germans always counterattacking. As James Holland always says, their Pavlovian need to always counterattack, exactly. And you know that, and you start to take advantage. And it reminds me of what we said right at the top of this show, of this myth that we have of the Russians and the Soviets just being a blunt instrument is anything but the truth. And they are learning, they are progressing, they're developing exactly the same things as we're developing, or we at the Western Front is developing. And this is fascinating. We had a question come in earlier talking about logistics from the Great Dominion. He's saying, and I'll expand it a bit, he's saying approximately what percentage of their petroleum diesel fuel did the Russians refine themselves? But I also want to open up to where the hell did they get their fuel from? Because, I mean, we know about the oil production there, but the distances are enormous and the number of vehicles and people have to move. So how was fuel managed? And again, to answer his questions, where did they get their fuel from?
That's a fascinating question. I would love to have percentages on that, and I can't give you a direct answer to that. Despite the German advance into the Caucasus, the Soviet Union did keep a lot of the Caucasian oil fields running. They were able to ship oil across the Caspian Sea even after the Germans had effectively cut off land contact. But there's no question an awful lot of petroleum did come from the United States. It was shipped across to the Soviet Far East and then put on trains and sent west. There weren't any huge pipelines running across Siberia as there are now, so most of this movement was by rail. And that was why it was so important to repair those damaged railways across Ukraine in particular as the Germans fell back, because this was how you kept the armies fueled and fed. The T-34s, of course, were all diesel-powered, and I think I'm right in saying that pretty much all of the Sherman tanks provided for the Soviet Union were the diesel-engined variant rather than the petroleum-engined variant.
Yeah, sounds right to me.
Right.
I'll be prepared to be proved wrong, but it sounds right to me. Yeah.
I remember hearing that most of the diesel-powered Shermans either went to the Soviet Union or were used in the Pacific theater, as opposed to the petroleum ones, which ended up in Europe. I may be wrong on that.
I think so, because I think it's not that we wanted the Soviets to have, or the Americans wanted the Soviets to have their money. It's just they didn't want those ones themselves. I think that they'd got their system worked up with gasoline so well. I think they didn't want those ones in Northwest Europe. That's how my brain is telling me. But I'm conscious of the fact I'm thoroughly enjoying this. We're nearly coming up to an hour. We should push on to the kind of the 44 era, because I know you wanted to talk about the real successes of the really well-led operations that came up later on. And we can always do a second part later on. If people are enjoying it, I'm enjoying it. If you're enjoying it, that's good. But so that, we've talked about the logistics, we've talked about these subtle improvements that have changed things. What's the next big kind of phase of improvement for the Red Army?
Well, in early 44, the Red Army achieves 2 encirclements in short order, right at the outset of the year. The first is at a city called Kirovograd in Ukraine, where they isolated the remnants of several divisions, but they couldn't hold on to them, and the Germans managed to break out quite quickly. The consequence of the Kirovograd action, though, was to create a salient in the German lines around the town of Korsun, and what followed became known as the Cherkasy encirclement, even though Cherkasy was actually in Soviet hands throughout the battle, largely because during the Cold War era, you could find Cherkasy on a map quite easily, and you couldn't find Korsun, and the Germans always referred to it as the Battle of Cherkasy. But they encircled the better part of 2 German corps in this encirclement. Again, they failed to crush the pocket quickly. This time they tried to invert it. They said, we'll turn the tanks outwards and send the cavalry corps inwards to break up the pocket. But they hit the same problem. The cavalry were too weak on their own to break up the corps. The artillery didn't move forward swiftly enough. And the tanks were too badly depleted to drive the Germans too far to the west. You end up with the Germans mounting a rescue operation to get those trapped Germans out. And a tremendous battle develops, because having failed to get 6th Army out of Stalingrad, Manstein is absolutely determined he's not going to leave any men behind this time. And the Germans mount an operation called Wanda, which goes through 2 phases. And by the end of this battle, you have more than 50% of the German panzer divisions on the Eastern Front involved in this battle. You have more than 50% of the Red Army's tank armies involved in this battle. This enormous clash. And extraordinarily, it comes down to control of 2 square kilometers of hillside. And there is this immense battle raging as the breakout begins. And in fact, the Germans manage to get most of their combat troops out, but they leave most of their equipment behind. This then, the lessons of this are digested in time for the summer, and this is the big offensive, Bagration against Army Group Center. And this takes place on the anniversary of the beginning of the war in the East. It's launched on 22nd of June. So this is the time when the Allies are trying to fight their way off the Normandy beaches. And the Red Army launches this absolutely colossal operation in the East. And in short order, they achieve a whole series of encirclements. It's not just one encirclement. They absolutely blow away Army Group Center at Vitebsk, Orsha, Bobruisk, and then at Minsk, a series of encirclement operations. And on each occasion, the encircled group is overwhelmed in very, very short order. They realize that once you've turned its flanks, once you've got behind them and met up, you've got to turn into the pocket very, very quickly before the pocket can harden. And at the same time, they manage to move resources west at tremendous pace to keep up the operation. And the striking thing of 1944 is that with a few minor exceptions, so for example, as Bagration finally runs out of steam on the approaches to Warsaw, Doug Nash has written a couple of superb books about the German recovery there. But that's almost unique in that the Panzer divisions return to some of their old killing power and their old strike power. Everywhere else, they are just not effective anymore. The pack front is able to kill German counterattacks dead. And the Red Army just maintains the pace of this operation. And this whole business of the enormous losses of the Red Army during these operations, no question, they lost a lot of men. But it's got to be put against, for example, British infantry losses during the fighting at Caen in the attempts to break out of Normandy. It's got to be put alongside Model's 9th Army losses on the northern flank of Kursk. You know, attacking even in 1943-44 is a difficult exercise. You're always going to lose a lot of men doing that. And
well, that's a very good point to make. It's one of my mantras is attacking is hard. Attacking is going to be hard, and it's always going to be costly. And Doug Nash did a great show with us last week, and he talked about that German, I'm going to call it kind of false victory near Warsaw, near the Vistula, because it was a victory, but it was their last hurrah, wasn't it? They expended so much in it. It was against the flow of the game. You know, it was a goal against the running of the match, and it just after that, the Soviets just were going to carry on with this steamroller, is the word Alexandra Ritchie used last week to describe it. You know, and although I think that's maybe not quite right, because a steamroller is a bit blunt and a bit it's not very complimentary in the same way. It is implying it's a dull object, when in what you're saying is actually the use of the flanks, the use of these encirclements and pincers is actually really quite astoundingly advanced for the time.
Yes, and it's this whole and now you have the full fruition of Tukhachevsky's old vision of the battle through the full depth of the enemy position. You have multiple echelons going into action. So as the first wave starts to run out of steam, there are fresh troops coming up behind it with adequate logistic support to maintain the impetus and to keep the Germans off balance, to keep throwing them back. And it's a very, very effective operation. And I guess, when you look at your earlier comment on who was it who was leading this, I think for me, the person who I think is the most underrated Soviet senior officer of the entire war is Vasilevsky, who was chief of the general staff during the war. If you can get hold of a copy of his memoirs, I thoroughly recommend that you read them. They are almost unique in the memoirs of any senior officer of any side, in that they are not remotely vainglorious. He freely admits to when he got things wrong. He is incredibly generous in his judgment of his contemporaries. And he talks, with great praise about some of his colleagues. He's also critical of them as appropriate. Even at one point where Joseph Stalin criticizes him, he just says something along the lines of, I understand that the pressure that the Supreme Commander was under at the time, and we didn't complain, we just took it. He comes over as a tremendous figure, and his book is well worth reading. And another of the unsung heroes was Tolbukin, who commanded 4th Ukrainian Front, right at the southern end of the Eastern Front. At the end of 43, Tolbukin spoke to his army and his corps commanders, and he said to them, "We've advanced across the Donbass. You have seen what the enemy has done to our territory. You have seen the smashed factories and the burned cities and the massacred villages. You have seen the dead. I want you to remember that it takes 4 years to build a factory. it takes 10 years to build a dam and a power station, but it takes 20 years to grow a Soviet soldier. Never forget that the soldiers whose lives have been entrusted to you are the property of the Soviet people, and it is your duty not to throw them away. Now, he was unusual in that, and people like Zhukov and Konyev were quite free about throwing their men into action. Zhukov once even rather disparagingly spoke to one of his army commanders after a failed attack and said something like, "So how many matchsticks did you break today?" Was quite callous about it. But there were officers like Tolbukin who took this very, very seriously and did what they could to keep their men alive.
I mean, that's fast. That quote that you read there was just fascinating. And let's not. It will not be. It's fair not to say that it's not just the Russians who have that approach. I mean, you could easily make the argument the Patton, it doesn't particularly care about his men compared to other commanders. There are Western Front commanders who are less about the love of their men. So it's not a uniquely Soviet thing to be in the Zhukov kind of, it's all just cannon fodder. But this has been an incredibly revealing and rewarding show. The comments coming are some of the best I've had for weeks. One person said this is the best live stream ever, someone said. So that's amazing praise for you, and we're going to have you back on to continue this, because I find it intensely fascinating. You're blowing myths wide open here about the Red Army. And so what you say you're working on a book now. You explain briefly, just for those who perhaps aren't familiar with your work, what you've been trying to do with your collected works and your methodology and what it is you're trying to bring to the game here.
Well, all of this started with a chance conversation. As some of your listeners may know, my profession, if you like, is as a doctor. I had a patient who was an elderly lady with a very strong German accent, and she used to come to see me for regular checkups. She had a long-term condition, and one day, she was beginning to suffer from dementia, so she used to slip into German sometimes during consultations, and my German was good enough that I could keep up with it, and we used to have these hilarious consultations in a mixture of English and German. And one day I just asked her, "So, Mrs. Caton, forgive me for asking, but where does your accent come from?" And she said, "Well, it's German." I said, "Yes, I know, but I don't recognize, some of the words you use, some of the idiom. I don't recognize which part of Germany." And she said, "Well, that's because my Germany doesn't exist anymore," which was a fascinating thing for someone to say. And she told me how she had grown up outside a city that is now called Kaliningrad, but it was then Königsberg. And during the war, she was a nurse. She worked in Königsberg. In 1944, her hospital was moved to the coast on the Baltic because of fears that the RAF could now reach that far east. And in fact, a week after they moved, the RAF bombed the heart out of the city. She was happy enough in this little seaside town because there was a military hospital next door, lots of young men to talk to, etc. When the final winter of the war came, she said that at one point the soldiers came to their accommodation and said, "Girls, we're leaving tonight. We've been ordered out. You've got to come with us." And the nurses said, "But the radio says the Red Army is still however many kilometers away." And they said, "Well, don't you believe it? If we've been told to go, it's time to go." So it was snowing very heavily. In fact, looking out the window, it's snowing quite heavily at the moment outside here too. But they met these soldiers on the edge of the village that night. The soldiers laughed at them and made them throw away their shoes and gave them boots, probably saved their lives, because the transport that they were waiting for didn't come. They had been cut off. They were pinned to the coast. And she ended up in a small port, which used to be called Pillau, and I think is now, or was at least, Sovietsk. I don't know if it's still called that after the fall of the Soviet Union. In peacetime, this town would have been home to about 10,000 people, but Pillau and the surrounding area was now home to 500,000 refugees. And she described how she worked with a refugee doctor in the city while the people were evacuated by sea. And in April 1945, she said, by now Pillau was under artillery fire. The soldiers came to the hospital and they told us they were being evacuated that night. If we could get to the East Harbour, there would be a ferry to take us off. And she said, when it started to get dark, we tried to get to the East Harbour, but the shelling was so hard we couldn't. We went down to the West Harbour instead. We could see that just across the water there was the end of a line of sand dunes that we knew ran all the way down to the Vistula. If we could get there, we could get to safety. We tried to build a raft. The raft was broken up by the waves even as we were launching it, and we thought it was the end. And then out of the darkness came a military ferry which had come to the wrong harbour by mistake. And she said, out of the ruins, some of the rear guard appeared, tumbled us onto the ferry. They took us to safety. By the time she reached Denmark, the war was over. But I thought, I know nothing at all about any of this. And that was what led to my first book, which was Battleground Prussia. And then each book in turn has led to another, a lot of leftover material that I wanted to research. I had a digression off into the First World War because I wanted to write about that, and that turned into 4 books. And then my publisher persuaded me to return to the Second World War. So we've now pretty much finished in Ukraine. The next book covers the Central Front in the summer, through 1942 really, and the battles around the Rzhev salient. After that, there is a project that I hope to complete that I've been working on for some time, which is about some of the German individuals involved in the Baltic Holocaust. In particular, not only just the monsters who perpetrated it, but a couple of the Germans who went to astonishing lengths to try to keep Jews alive, but they've just been forgotten. And I think it would be nice to shine a spotlight on that little bit of light in the darkness, if you like. Yeah. And then after that, I hope to do Leningrad as a 2-volume work. But
well, well, we had someone earlier on say that Leningrad is the more important quote unquote battle than Stalingrad, longer, bigger, more complex. Anyway. We're gonna need to bring things to them because you can have too much of a good thing. Honestly, Prit, the comments today have been the best I've had on the show for 2 or 3 weeks. It's amazing. I've really enjoyed it. So we will put our heads together, and if you're happy to come back, we'll look at something, perhaps a narrower focus. Perhaps we'll just look at one of the operations, look at something on an operational basis. Will be quite interesting. The Ukraine or something, anyway, we'll put our heads together. In terms of what we've got coming up, folks, don't forget we've got a packed agenda. We've got Steve Darlow coming on tomorrow night. If you can't be anywhere else on St. Valentine's Day, the restaurants are closed. You can come and learn about Flight Path to Murder, a horrible incident of some RAF air crews falling fate of the Germans. Then we've got lots more coming up next week. We've got the 1939 happenings in Poland. We've got Iwo Jima week coming up. We've got RAF week coming up. We've got lots coming up. So as always, don't forget to click subscribe if you haven't already. Check out our Patreon page. Check out Prit's books. People have already bought Prit's books while they've been watching the shows. That's good. That helps pay his wages, if you like. It helps me as well. So that's great. And share what we're doing on social media. We're still gaining an audience. We'd like to get a bigger audience. So do what you can to help us out. Prit, I've learned so much today. I learned some from your book. I've learned so much today. Will you come back and do more?
I would love to, really.
Well, we'll do that. So I'm going to end the stream now, folks. Enjoy your afternoon. Enjoy the weekend. We haven't had any snow here yet in Normandy, but I expect it'll come at some point. Prit, thanks again. Thanks for watching, everybody. And thank you, everybody, for your great comments. I've been sharing a lot of them on screen there. That's why we do these shows live. We love the interaction. We love to engage with people. There's something about being able to talk to the historians you look to and admire to and engage with them. It's the era we live in. We like to vote on our talent shows on TV. Not that I do that myself, but we like to engage with our heroes, if you like. And this is a format where you can put questions, and we love that. And so, again, thanks for watching, everybody. I will see you all next week. Thank you. Bye.